it's a difficult path to tread, and the effort is what makes it valuable. The fact that you have to put an effort to do it, that you have to put the hard work in, as a society, as a culture, as a species, have taken a very long time to get where we are, and we've got some long-standing patterns and habits, and if we want to change those things, it's going to take more than an instant to change it.
Nicholas, thank you so much for being here with Ichan School Institute today, all the way from Australia. I know it's early morning there for you. So Nicholas, you are the inaugural director at the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. That's a really big role and really inspiring for us. So can you share with us, how did this manifest? How did the Contemplative Studies Centre manifest at the university?
It was something of a COVID kind of fever dream, as it were. So I don't know if all your listeners will know, but Melbourne sort of was one of the most locked down cities in the world. So we spent a significant amount of time in our homes in 2020 and 2021. And so it was during that period that I really started to think quite specifically about the idea for the center and have conversations around it. And so I guess it was really sort of in seeing that, in particularly in North America and in Europe, there were a lot of efforts to promote meditative activities and access to traditions and sanghas. And we didn't really have much of that going on in Australia. I think just as a function of scale, we don't have quite as much going on here. So that presented the opportunity to have some conversations about sort of, do we need something comparable in Australia? And what particularly I think I was most excited about was the possibility sort of leveraging or utilizing kind of what's gone really well for the centers that exist in North America and Europe, and also kind of, I guess, being smart about some of what I think maybe the mistakes have been. So some of the centers have focused really on mindfulness, which I don't necessarily think is a mistake, but I do think sort of it means that it narrows the scope of what those centers are able to focus on and talk about. So ultimately, sort of how things happened here in Australia was that I was connected with a philanthropist, Mr. Martin Hosking, and he was inspired by this particular idea of a center that sort of could be an academic sort of source of information for the broader public and population, a place of research, a place of education, right? So providing access to contemplative practices, but also a resource for people who are looking to engage with practices and have discussions with the traditions that they come from. And so that was also particularly important for us as a center when we were setting ourselves up, was that we didn't want deference to science or the traditions. We wanted something of parity. So we wanted there to be dialogue. And in the Australian context, I think that's particularly notable because Australia sort of is quite secular in its orientation, and there aren't religious studies departments on university campuses. So it was really important to us as we talk about these practices that we get the balance right and understanding who's coming to the table and who's part of the conversation and who is considered the authority when we talk about these practices, and how do we make that determination. It was a $10 million philanthropic gift, and that's what got us going in 2021. It's been a lot of work, but it's also been a lot of fun.
Amazing. Your center, it just sounds so much like what we're doing, bridging the traditions with science. So it's very exciting. Tell me, Nicholas, what were some of the initial challenges, the hurdles you had to go through to make this happen?
Look, there's challenges on a number of fronts, right? There's logistic challenges, sort of working within the context of a university and sort of thinking about how universities operate and how they make sense of the world and how they even manage their budgets and revenue. So there was a number of challenges there because sometimes ideas like this and programs like this don't really fit neatly into kind of the way that traditional, particularly secularly oriented sort of institutions and organizations kind of like to operate. And so there's challenges of thinking about sort of running educational offerings and how they make sense in a university. There are also challenges in the dialogues of conversations with different traditions. I think a particular sort of notable challenge was along the lines of what people count or consider to be evidence. And so that's a conversation we've been having over and over from the very beginning of our establishment of a center, but what is evidence and how do we think about evidence? And that sort of has also fed into our research, which has meant we've had to really think very carefully about what is it that the scientific model can support and not support? And we've had a lot of dialogues around this idea that there may be some things that the scientific enterprise and the scientific way of evaluating things is just not suited to answering. And what that may mean sort of is that, there are some things that are just better left to philosophy and religion. And there are certain circumstances under which we think that these different orientations of the perspective on things can meet and dialogue and debate and integrate. And then there are certain circumstances where sometimes you just have to agree to disagree and sort of respectfully recognize that, there's probably no amount of evidence that is going to convince people who are already aligned to one particular position or another. And so I think that's been a really important element in our growth and understanding, is figuring out how to navigate that. I would also say it's been really important for us to not shy away from difficult conversations. And I think particularly sort of in the current context that we find ourselves in globally, I think that's more important than ever. I think people are reluctant to have difficult conversations. I think there's a lot of shouting and vitriol and anger, but there's not a lot of real sitting down and genuinely hearing out the other individual and having mutual respect and a willingness kind of to engage with the argument that the other party is presenting. And I think that is absolutely necessary if we're going to advance a true field of contemplative studies, where we take seriously what the traditions are presenting, as well as sort of thinking seriously about how we can study these things from an experiential as well as academic perspective.
Yeah. How did you convince the University of Melbourne to allow this?
Look, I think there were a few arguments. I mean, I think having an external donor that's passionate about this and sort of is willing to support it, really is always going to be a significant point of leverage for a major institution. I think the broader argument really at the end of the day that they recognized was that there's considerable value to the university community, and particularly to our students and staff, which is to say that there's kind of this narrative and something that I've kind of presented, that historically most people sort of recognized or found themselves to be part of religious institutions. And over time, for various reasons, that's become increasingly not the case. So a lot of people increasingly sort of would not align or recognize themselves as part of a particular religious institution. That doesn't mean they're not religious or that they're not spiritual. It just means a lot of people have had a sense of falling out with traditional organizations or institutions. At the same time, people have really looked to science or naturalism to provide explanations and about what's purposeful and what's meaningful. And I think I mentioned COVID in the context of COVID, and that became so apparent for many of us as we sat in our homes and sort of had our normal kind of liberties and, structures and senses of purpose kind of taken away from us. And so I think there was this sense of, okay, we're all really seeking meaning and purpose, but we gave up on the idea that religion could provide it for us. We thought maybe naturalism and science could do it, and it really hasn't done what we hoped. And so there's a gap. We don't really kind of have a way of going forward, or we don't really know what to do. I think related to that as well, our students and our staff, we send many of our students out into the world in Australia without having given them any education around religious traditions or worldviews and perspectives. And the argument that I keep going back to is that at the end of the day, it's not about proselytizing. It's not about convincing people to convert. It's about teaching people that other people in the world have these perspectives. And if you want to have a meaningful discussion or engagement with them, it's very helpful for you to understand the perspective they might be coming from. So even people who are engaging in commerce, it's beneficial to understand that Christianity or Buddhism or Confucianism might underlie the way they think about and understand the world. So I think ultimately that was quite compelling to the university, both that there's a very practical element to what we do and how we think about it, but it's also sort of a very deep kind of existential meaning to what the center is all about.
Lovely. In your center, I saw it does a lot with mindfulness, but you say mindfulness is not enough. So tell me, how does it go from mindfulness to something else? What's happening?
Yeah, so the challenge I think with mindfulness, and many have talked about this and acknowledged it, and I'm not the only one by any means. The challenge sort of is that there was a really strong effort with the mindfulness movement, as it were, sort of to make ideas, particularly from Buddhism, broadly accessible and compatible. And many have argued sort of that pushing particular versions or ideas of mindfulness have meant sort of that we stripped it back too far, and sort of we in essence sort of commodified this idea and lost the things that critically surround mindfulness. I often think of the idea that mindfulness is just one really tiny component of mental development, and alongside that we've got this idea of recognizing worldviews or perspectives as well as ethical orientations. And if we're not really considering those other things, I'm not entirely sure what mindfulness practices look like or what they mean. And so it's really important for us, I think, to recognize that there's an incredible amount of ambiguity about mindfulness. And so when you talk about mindfulness, some people think it's just something you naturally have and you don't need to do anything. Some people think you go to your gym and they have a mindfulness thing. Some people think it's, drawing in a coloring book or staring up at clouds. Some people think, you go to a course with your psychologist to learn about it. Some people think you need to go off to retreats with monastics to learn about it. And that variety poses a challenge for all of us, in that given that any given individual could think that it's any and all of that, it's very hard to provide clarity with respect to what we're talking about. So I think it is really important for us to recognize that the version of mindfulness that we understand is very complicated, and it doesn't have kind of a one-to-one correspondence between any particular teachings or traditions. In essence, I would argue Western mindfulness is a novel thing. We've created a new version of practice that arguably doesn't have historical precedent per se. Now, I would also say sort of that when we're doing academic research, it is actually quite important to recognize that we have by far the most evidence for mindfulness-based programs. So things like mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So there is a lot of utility, particularly when we're talking about publicly funded programs, health, education-related offerings, that we do kind of lean on the evidence that we have, and we do leverage that. But it's also really important to recognize that not everybody wants that version of things. And many people already have their own contemplative practices. Many communities have their own contemplative practices. So I think arriving at those communities and saying, you ought to do the thing that we want you to do doesn't make a lot of sense. And it repeats a pattern that colonizers have sort of, unfortunately, implemented on the local indigenous peoples over and over and over again. And we need to be very careful that we don't continue that pattern. And we need to recognize that people may already have their own practices, and that this idea that we have of mindfulness may not necessarily be completely compatible with those practices as they exist in local communities. So it's about then matching concepts of evidence accumulation and evaluation with what are the beliefs and ideas and practices of a local community. So going beyond mindfulness is both recognizing that Western ideas of mindfulness don't even match with Buddhist ideas of mindfulness, but moreover that there's this much bigger idea of contemplative practices that include things like prayer, connection to country, and a variety of things that people do, and kind of recognizing that there's value in those practices as well. And at the core, we ought to be thinking about and looking at those things.
I love so much how you mentioned colonialization. My personal work is, I think, how to decolonialize the mindfulness movement. And as you said, like the working definition in the West, nobody agrees upon.
Yeah, so I mean, not certainly academics and researchers don't, but neither do Buddhist scholars, right? And arguably neither necessarily do Buddhist practitioners. And I don't know that that's a problem, but it is a point of, it is something we should be embracing and discussing, and we should be providing clarification. I've seen a movement towards kind of giving up on mindfulness, as it were, and starting to talk about compassion. And I think there's risk there that we just repeat the same mistake unless we really engage in the deep, meaningful conversations about what is the practice that we're talking about? How do we want to use it? We risk kind of just going, well, we're not talking about mindfulness anymore. We're talking about compassion. But in essence, we're talking about the same problem, and we're talking about the same techniques and approaches that are applied to the problems. And so swapping out the name from mindfulness to compassion doesn't fix the problem per se. Mm-hmm. The problem is that we're not clear on kind of the origins, the implications, the motivations, the rationale for the practice. And we're not clear about what it is that we're asking people to do. So I think until we actually address that problem head on, it doesn't matter what we call it. We can call it, we can call it mindfulness, we call it compassion, we can come up with something else entirely, but we really need to address that problem of what are the conceptualizations and the ideas about the practice, and where are they coming from? Is it a colonial idea? Is it a Western idea? Is it an Asian idea? Is it, as often is the case, is it an Eastern idea that's been brought to the West, has been reinterpreted, and then sent back to the East? So you get these layers upon layers of complexity.
Yeah, so much work there. How do you help your students and even the instructors in your programs when they want to jump to extremes, right? I mean, what you're describing is the same extreme we went through in modernity, right? And colonialization, and from religion to only critical thinking, to no spirituality, these extremes, right? I mean, we've just put on a different label, put on a different Band-Aid, but the wound is still there.
I think, it's an incredibly challenging endeavor to undertake, because people like simplicity. And I can't argue with them that things would be easier if there was simple explanations for things. I think the reality is, more often than not, the explanation is subtle and complex. And so I think there is a need for us to avoid, or sort of try to not sort of give in to the temptation to think that things are simple, and not to sort of go to one extreme or the other, recognizing that, to use a Buddhist term, that there is a middle way. There is sort of a path of compromise, and a recognition that, there isn't one simple explanation for everything for every person. So when we kind of present to our students about this, and when we talk with educators or staff that are wanting to do research or academic work on this, that's kind of the position that we take, is that before you kind of come to conclusions, it's really important that you try to entertain or understand different perspectives. So understand the different sides and why they're making the arguments they are. Why is it that some communities really value personal first-person experiential experience as the most important form of evidence? Why is it that other communities value randomized controlled trials and sort of cumulative evidence? And really recognizing and trying to arguing to both of those communities and to all of these people involved that there are pros and cons to each, which is to say sort of that, a case study and an N of one is always an N of one. And randomized controlled trial will always be an average, right? And so the average is going to miss the individual, and the individual can't necessarily generalize to the average. But if we don't have these two things talking to one another, if we don't understand what the population looks like, but also understand that the individuals that comprise that population, we're going to be missing something really important. So we have to figure out how these two pieces fit together. And I think it looks like kind of encouraging dialogue. And, we utilize the framework that Francisco Varela advocated in our educational work to say, we really try to encourage students to think about first, second, and third person perspectives as they're engaging in the practices, as they're conducting academic studies of the practices, to see what it feels like for themselves. We encourage them to try multiple different practices, to have dialogue with others and representatives of different traditions, including academic and philosophical traditions, and then to look at the research evidence and say, what does it say and what are its limitations, right? So really, I think trying to advocate, there's multiple different perspectives for a second and third, and they all have pros and cons, and they can talk to each other. I think critically, we also emphasize that they're not necessarily going to agree, and that's okay. They don't necessarily have to agree, because they're not always speaking to the same thing, right? They may speak to different elements or aspects of experience, and that's okay. It's okay for things to not align.
Yeah. What does the research look like at your center?
So look, we have a mix of different programs and offerings that we engage in. We have kind of core flagship research projects that we're undertaking. The core work is quite practical. So the two kind of main projects we're undertaking are really looking at questions of applications of meditation practices. So really trying to understand how people are utilizing meditative practices to address issues like health and well-being. And we're particularly trying to address these issues of commodification and reductionism. So we're really trying to understand how these app companies and these sort of online gurus and people that are sort of providing videos or selling people thousands of dollars of workshops, do they have any kind of a valid argument? Is it really the case that spending $100 on an app and practicing for 5 minutes once can deliver on all of the great things that they promise me? So we're really trying to understand, how much is enough? At what point, what's the minimum amount of contribution that people might have to make to a practice to start seeing some return on the investment? And we think it's really important that argument be pursued empirically, because I think to a certain extent, that's the only way to to combat the argument, the kind of commercial drive that's out there of kind of saying, less and less and less will give you the same outcomes. And there's no real incentive for a lot of these organizations to evaluate or study their programs. It sort of behooves them to just make bigger and bigger claims and say less and less and less. And so for us, given that we're philanthropically funded, there was this really strong drive to say we need to actually study the amounts, the doses, what it takes, and what we might expect from the different doses, and doses and frequencies and things like that. So we are looking at kind of how do people use apps, and what are the relationships between amount and style of practice and the kinds of outcomes people get. And then we're going back and looking at what are people's motivations, because we fully recognize that people who engage in these practices for spiritual growth or transcendence are probably not necessarily moving the scale on depression or well-being in the same way as people who want these things for stress reduction or for mental health. The other side of our core research really is focusing on progress paths, pitfalls. So how people who are committed to a particular tradition can make sense of the kinds of things that happen to them over time, and whether or not traditional maps, so things like the stages of insight, whether they may hold any value for contemporary practitioners, because we have been looking into and trying to understand when people struggle with their practice, and that can look like they're just having a hard time, or something really wild comes up. What do they do with it? How do they make sense of it? And how could we better support people to make sense of these things as they arise? And are these kind of things necessary elements of the practice? So do people need to go through hardship in order to make progress? Is that just part of how it works? Or is that a risk? Is that a sort of safety issue where we're not managing it properly because we don't have communities around these practitioners as they're engaging in it, and they don't know enough about what they're getting into. So those are two really big components. Look, we do have a number of other research projects as well where we're engaging with people in the arts, people in the humanities. We're having conversations about art. We're having conversations about gender studies. We're having conversations around all kinds of different things, public health issues. So we have all these like little projects as well. And we've had seed funded grants where we're trying to look at these issues to try to encourage the community of researchers that work with us to take these things up and advance them as well.
Yeah. These days, it seems these ancient traditions and modern traditions, I would say, they're taken so out of context, right? Many would even argue that that's why people have difficult experiences, because people are like, I'm going to go do shamatha, and at the same time I'm going to do yoga, and at the same time I'm going to do whatever else, you name it. In America, people oftentimes combine psychedelics with contemplative practice, and they have experiences that they feel are harmful, or they express as being very difficult. So there's a lot of confusion, right? Scholars, practitioners alike. So how do you deal with that? And how do you ensure there's authenticity, not only within the study, right? Not only preventing bias within the study, but authenticity in maintaining the traditions in the work?
It's a real challenge. I mean, I think the ways in which you do this research, always have limits. And I think doing studies well, integrating sort of engaging stakeholders from multiple traditions and perspectives takes a lot of time. And I think the unfortunate reality sort of in the world that we live in, and the funders and the people that provide the support for the work that we do, often are not permissive of the amount of time that it takes. And they're not supportive. Universities are not supportive of the fact that a well-conducted study having dialogue with multiple traditional representatives, as well as scientists and people from the humanities who can recognize all these different features or aspects of these experiences, it's going to take several years. Oftentimes, the beginning part is just coming up with a shared common language. And I think when we're talking about difficult or challenging experiences, we haven't actually done that work. So this is sort of something that we're quite aware of, that, when we talk about what this experience is when it arises. So if someone has a challenging or difficult experience, I think first and foremost, we need to recognize what is the language that people use to describe it. And there is a trend or a pattern kind of among society to identify anything that is uncomfortable as harmful or fundamentally distressing. And this is something that I've written about that I think is really important, that we recognize that discomfort is just a fundamental part of life, and us turning away from it or avoiding it is actually not advantageous or helpful to us. And in fact, I would argue it's harmful to us, to basically avoid anything that might result in some level of discomfort. We know from psychotherapy research that in order to have good outcomes, you're likely going to have some level of discomfort. Now, I would also argue, however, that discomfort is different to distress. And so people actually really being harmed is something that we do need to be aware of. But as you say, I think the challenge becomes in that harm. What are we talking about? How do we make sense of that harm? And sometimes what we have a tendency to do, and we've done this in our own research, made this mistake, that there are medical definitions of harm and there are ways of looking at it. And sometimes we can be too quick to sort of say, well, there's harm because a mental health or a scientific scale suggests that harm is there. Whereas within the context of a tradition, people might say, well, that's actually not harmful. So ultimately, what we've really tried to do sort of is to say, we need dialogue between representatives from the mental health community. We need representatives from the traditions and practitioners so that they can help us make sense of this. And we need representatives among the practitioner stakeholders so that they can help us understand how they feel about this. One of our big goals is, in essence, truth in advertising. What we really want is for people to be aware of the kinds of things that they're agreeing to. I think historically, it made a lot of sense for people who were going down a path of contemplative practice, what was likely going to happen to them and what they may have to commit to that practice and what they may have to give up, I think more importantly, or what kinds of knocks they might expect as a result. And I don't know that we necessarily see that in a lot of contemporary practice. So one of the challenges is, as you have Westerners engaging with apps or going on retreats, they're not necessarily aware of the fact that things will happen and these things may be challenging. And there is this kind of risk or this issue that people don't really talk about the things that could arise or they could happen. So in essence, from my perspective, we're not doing our job as providers in explaining what those things look like and explaining how we will manage them and what we will do with them and evaluating whether or not the practice is appropriate for people given the likelihood of those things arising. So all of that said, I think many traditions actually have really good plans in place to manage these kinds of things as they come up and are really great at explaining to people, yes, you're going to have to make some sacrifices if you want to go down this path, but there is something to be gained at the end of it. And I don't know that we explain that well enough, which is to say, I think people need to go into these things with their eyes open and make decisions for themselves, with their clinicians, with their families, with their communities about whether that is the thing they want. And I would often say that for someone who's seeking stress reduction, there may be better ways to do it. If all you want sort of is to sleep a little bit better, signing up for a multi-day intensive retreat is probably not the best way to get there. And I frankly have no issue with saying, take up jogging, right? But if you really want to understand what's going on sort of internally, if you want to get to better know your interior, you want to understand something about meaning and purpose, these practices in many ways are ideal, but I can promise you there will be some level of discomfort. I would hope that as you engage with that discomfort, you have a teacher who knows the difference between discomfort and distress and knows how to guide you, to recognize the difference. And when you get to distress, they know where to send you or what to do with you to kind of manage that.
Yeah, and you remind me, one of the most helpful advice I ever received from my own teacher was to distinguish the difference when the mind is creating the story of harm and the body, right? Because the mind, isn't it so, Nicholas, like when we have the neurons, the habit is changing. The neurons are going to have to fire a different way, right? The neural pathways in the brain are changing. Of course, there's going to be discomfort, but that's not danger. That's the process. So how do you even begin that conversation with someone who may come to you and say, Nicholas, I just want to come here and get enlightened, or I want to come here and have X, Y, and Z experience?
Look, I'm a clinical psychologist by background and training. And so I often, and I'm a very pragmatic one at that, and I think many people advocate this idea that, we ought to prefer psychotherapy over medications. And I think in general, I completely understand that argument. And I think in general, I would rather that people engage in a meaningful process or practice of self-change supported by someone who's coaching them to change their behavior than agree to take a medication from a company that probably doesn't have their best interest in mind, and for which they're probably going to be on it for the rest of their lives. However, what I also say to people is that if you're not actually prepared to do the work of therapy, if you're not actually able to commit to that for various reasons, people have life constraints. They have multiple jobs. They don't necessarily always have the privilege to consider the more challenging or difficult option. And so I think people need to make that choice of, do they feel like they're able to commit to that? And then we as providers or professionals say, how can we support you if you're going to commit to that? And so I think that's a big part of it for me, is saying, you need to be aware of what could happen. You need to make a choice that makes sense for you, and you need to recognize that there aren't any shortcuts, right? Taking a psychedelic, whether or not that gives you insight, I don't know. I remain agnostic about that. I've not seen data that sort of has convinced me one way or the other on that subject. But much as is the case in traditional psychotherapy, and I'm thinking in particular with psychoanalysis, it may give you insights, but what do you do with the insight? Right. And so committing to actually having a plan of action subsequent to the insight, I think, is so critical. And I think the same thing can happen in meditation practices, right? You may have some insight. It may be a helpful insight. It may be a harmful insight. But what you do with it is ultimately what matters, right? If you recognize that you have some unresolved trauma, if you recognize sort of that something's there that sort of is holding you back, you have to be prepared to then figure out how to work with that. Because if you're not and you just run away from it, it's not going anywhere. That recognition of that insight that you had is still going to be there. That trauma will still be there unresolved, whether you run from it or not. The insight that you have that, all of life is not impermanent and we're all connected, it's essentially meaningless if you don't commit to some kind of action, right? I mean, if you work in a job where you're exploiting people for a living and, ultimately what you do is harmful to the majority of people on the planet, well, that insight that we're all connected is in many ways, I think, kind of meaningless if you don't put it into action. So when people come to me and say things like, I just want to be less stressed, or, or even, I really want the higher stages of jhanas or enlightenment, my response is there aren't shortcuts, right? Like, I would love, it would be convenient. It would be nice if there were a pill you could take that could get you there, but I'm not convinced that there is. I don't think that's how life works. I don't think that's how humans work. I think it takes time. It takes commitment. It takes effort. And fundamentally, we don't like effort. We don't like committing time to things, but that's the reality of it. It's a difficult path to tread. And I think the effort is what makes it valuable. The fact that you have to put an effort to do it, that you have to put the hard work in, is, I think, what ultimately sort of makes the end result more useful, because I don't think the end result is actually the thing that we should be focused on, right? I think we mistake the kind of end point or the goal for why we do it. And I think the insights, to my mind, and the benefits really are in the practice itself. Putting things into action, recognizing what we get as we're doing it, I think allows us to see benefits that we might never have imagined, to these practices, but also challenges, some things that are wrong within us that we need to work on, or things that are wrong with our society that we need to work on. So it is in that work, I think, that we really need to focus. But as you said, it's hard, right? Because people want quick fixes. They want panaceas. They want easy ways of addressing problems. And I think more than ever at the moment, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a pill we could all take that just made everything wonderful and everyone happy and everyone enlightened? But I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, people want instant noodles, and then they get toxicity.
I mean, there's sort of this joke of, in psychotherapy, sort of, that people will say, right, of, someone comes to you and will say, fix me. And, the kind of common response that you give as a clinician sort of is, if you're working with someone who's 35 years old, you might say, well, it took you 35 years to become this way. We're not going to fix it in a day or a week or even 8 weeks, right? I mean, the reality sort of is you've got a lifetime's worth of patterns and behaviors. And we as a as a society, as a culture, as a species, have taken a very long time to get where we are. And we've got some long-standing patterns and habits. And if we want to change those things, it's going to take more than an instant to change it.
Yeah, the right effort. So, Nicholas, right now at the center, it sounds like actually there's a lot happening, right? Different practices are happening, different views, different perspectives. And you mentioned dialogue over and over and over again. This seems to actually be the methodology in itself or the first maybe methodology for research in contemplative pedagogy and contemplative praxis in general. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really started at a point of dialogue to try to understand where different communities and traditions are coming from, and to really try to understand how different stakeholders view these practices and think about what they want to get out of them. But it does present challenges, I think, because as we've had these dialogues, what we've come to recognize is that, as I think I mentioned earlier, some communities are already wholly convinced that their practices work. And that's not a problem per se. I don't object to people believing that the thing they do benefits them. The challenge is in having this conversation saying, that's wonderful for you and your community, but if you ever want to convince other people to take up this practice, you can't just preach to the choir, right? In essence, you have to think about what kind of evidence it might take to engage people who are not so convinced by the practice. And I think that can be hard to hear. People don't want to be told that the evidence is not as robust as they might think it is for the practice that they love and that has made such a difference to their own life. So dialogue is essential, but I think critically, there's a particular flavor to that dialogue, which is, genuine, authentic, engaged dialogue where people are actually listening to each other and hearing each other out. And so, because a lot of times when you have that genuine dialogue, you're going to hear things that you don't like. Much as we were just talking about the practice, there's an element of discomfort in dialogue. And I think my sense is sort of, if there isn't that discomfort, then the dialogue is not necessarily as productive as it could be. You probably know that you need more people in the room if the dialogue is always happy and wonderful and everyone is agreeing with each other. Something's not right about the composition of the group in the room if there isn't some discomfort among some of the members. In essence, I'm not convinced you're making progress, right, if you're not reaching people outside of your usual circles. Because there's plenty of people that are already convinced that contemplative practices are wonderful and that we all should be doing them. The question is, can we reach a broader audience who might be open to these practices? Can we reach a broader audience of very specific contemplative practitioners who have their version of things and want nothing to do with us? They think that we're too westernized, that we're too scientific, or we're too academic. So how do we get them to be part of the conversations? And I think the challenge is, people can only ever come willingly. So we have to entice them. We have to make it worth their while. And sometimes they just don't want to come, right? So that's the other challenge of it. And that's the bit of kind of having patience in undertaking this work and having some self-kindness and self-compassion, and recognizing that as much as we may want to bring these people to the table and to engage in dialogue with them, not everyone is ready. And that doesn't mean we don't keep trying, but it also means that we have to be gentle with ourselves in recognizing that sometimes, it's that other people are just not ready for the discussion. And that's not necessarily our fault.
Why are people so afraid of discomfort?
I mean, it's uncomfortable, right? I think this sort of is this recognition. I mean, we've coached people for so long, and particularly sort of in the US, particularly in North America, we have coached people that if there's discomfort, you take a pill. If you have a small amount of pain, discomfort, you can quickly engage in some kind of action that can make it go away. So we've in essence kind of created and similar sort of, I think, with social media and sort of the kind of the current kind of economic situation where you want something you like, you click a button, it'll be the package will arrive at your door within hours, right? I mean, we have this kind of society that has increasingly become one of immediate gratification. And the flip side of that is that the more and more that immediate gratification has been emphasized, it's also emphasized this idea of, if you don't like something, you should be able to get rid of it quickly. And all you have to do is buy something or pay for something, pay for a service, pay for a thing, pay for a guru to talk you through something, and they will make that pain go away, right? So I think the reality sort of is, discomfort is hard to work with. And we've been coached to think that we shouldn't have to, because we've been coached to think that there's a product out there that we can pay for that will get rid of it. So I think people increasingly sort of have this tendency to just go, well, why should I engage with discomfort? Why should I let it be there when it's really simple for me to press a button or just ignore it? I mean, I think the reality is, in essence, we're all being swindled, right? I mean, we can make it go away temporarily, but that's at best all we're ever doing. Right. We may be avoiding the problem in the short term, but it will always continue to be there. So I think if we trade kind of the future for the now, as it were, we're not really gaining as a whole. At some point, the bill comes due. And I think we need to be aware of that. But I think it's a conversation as a society that we haven't really had yet, or maybe we're just starting to have, which is that if we're going to find compromise, if we're going to find the point in which we can agree on a path to move forward, we're going to have to embrace discomfort. These are going to be challenging conversations. And I think even within the contemplative practice community, I think in getting some corporations, CEOs, leaders of countries to the table, I think sometimes we have compromised too much to get them to be part of the conversation. And often I wonder to myself, who has influenced who more in those conversations? When we've been part of trying to influence corporate leaders, governments, industry, are we as contemplative practitioners and people who are advancing or advocating for a more compassionate, kinder, gentler world, are we influencing them to be that, or are they rubbing off on us more and making us more ruthless, us more short-term focused? So I think that we need to also kind of be aware ourselves of the risk that is there, and we need to be prepared for it and how to kind of, I guess, guard against it, ensure that we stay true to kind of the convictions that we have and the reasons why we engage in these practices and these processes and these dialogues to begin with.
Yeah, it's like, where am I being a people pleaser and for what?
Yeah, to what end, as you say, right? I think that the goal, I mean, if we're talking about a really big end goal, which is sort of, making the world a better place for everyone, for all beings, right? Making life better for all beings, it's a really valuable, important goal. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. And I do think, again, going back to sort of, why our center got taken up and why there is a really important place for contemplative practices at this moment now, is that these practices in all their varied forms actually allow people to reconnect with exactly those things, right? There's a student that I've engaged with a few times talking about the idea of daily prayers in Islam. And, there is the connection to Allah and a higher power, but there's also the grounding that exists in the practice, in the prayer itself. So there's a reminder in that practice of, why are you here? What are you doing? Right. And so I think there does need to be a bit of flexibility if we define our values and we never allow ourselves the possibility of changing them or compromising on those values. I think, again, we're falling into the trap of, being too convicted or too adherent to a very firm and unwavering way of looking at things. I think we always need to be open-minded and curious. But I do think there is value sort of in reminding ourselves of why we're engaged in a particular process in the first place.
I love that. Remember your why. It seems like that is actually also a really important key. Why are we practicing? Having the right view, right understanding of the practice, reflecting on that, and then only engaging with it. Otherwise, how can it be sustainable if we have the mind of the consumer, the mind of the dopamine addict?
Yeah, I think there's a real challenge among a number of practitioner leaders in the community where, and we've seen this in research studies, of sort of these practices can just make us more narcissistic, right? Now, I don't have any concern that that's the case for the mainstay of these practices, but I think if the reason that you're getting into the practice is to make you more efficient in doing what you already do, and that thing that you already do is not something that's necessarily good for the world, I can see how that might be the case. There's the example of the mindful sniper, right? If we train, one could argue sort of that a sniper already has all the qualities of kind of Western mindfulness. Perhaps minus the ethics and the worldview perspectives, right? So if we're only focusing on that denatured, commodified, stripped back version of things, we may in essence train someone to be more of the worst version of humanity, right? As opposed to the best. So I think it's really important that we keep in mind, why are we doing this? And I would agree with you. I think if your sole reason for advocating and engaging in these practices is sort of self-promotion and self-growth, I think you're always going to be disappointed, right? Because there is an element to many of these practices where as you engage with the interior, there are things there that you don't like. And if you're looking for self-promotion and self-growth and it's all about you, you're going to continue to come up against the stuff that you don't like. So I think, if that's your main goal in doing this thing, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a bit frustrating, right? So I am convinced sort of that if you can set yourself aside a little bit and you can move beyond the idea that this is just for you and commit even a little bit to the idea that making oneself better for the sake of others is a really laudable and valuable goal, I think there is the great possibility that you may benefit in the process. But that's kind of the irony of the practice, is by letting go of personal goals and personal objectives, that's when I think there is the greatest possibility for individual benefit.
Altruism. How can I transform myself for the sake of others?
Yeah, or in the classic context, right, the Bodhisattva's vow, right, which I think is something we don't talk about enough. The idea of sort of, there are practitioners sort of who, in theory and from traditional perspectives, could have transcended the plane, but have made a commitment to sticking around for the betterment of all beings. And I think that's a really incredibly wonderful gesture. This idea of you have people that are kind of at their peak, that sort of are able to achieve great things, but they've decided to utilize those great things, not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of all beings. And I think if we had a little bit of that attitude in the world more broadly, how much better of a world it would be.
Yes. I love that you brought that up. And I was a little hesitant thinking, should I say that? Would mention the Bodhisattva path. Is that part of your practice, Nicholas?
Look, it's a challenge for me. Like, I wouldn't necessarily define myself as someone who is an ardent traditional Buddhist by any sense. I was raised sort of in a traditional, quite conservative Christian house. And so I have my reservations about very organized religions because it didn't work well for me. And I think I've met a lot of people within the Christian church, particularly since moving to Australia, who are absolutely wonderful people. And I think had they been in my life at the time that I was experiencing the distress and discomfort with the institution that I was part of, I think I probably would have gone down a very different path. So I think I'm always quite interested in religious perspectives and views, and I think I'm quite open-minded about them. And I'm a very committed agnosticist for that reason, because I think my commitment is that I think that is the only way that I can genuinely be open-minded about the possibilities and perspectives of people on the entire spectrum, of atheist to theist and everywhere in between. But, I'm inclined towards the principles and the ideas behind something like the Bodhisattva vow. And there's a lot of ideas within the Buddhist tradition that really resonate with me and make a lot of sense. There are other ideas within Buddhism that sort of, I can't quite embrace, but I also don't object to other people holding those views. And I think the same of Islam and Christianity. So I think it's really important kind of to recognize, what the value can be in these traditions and practices. I think it's also important kind of to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is to say sort of, there are versions of these practices that have been stripped back so far that they look nothing like the original. And so I think we do need to have a genuine conversation about, is the thing that we're advocating and offering, is it a Buddhist practice? Well, I don't know. What is Buddhism, And it's the same thing in Christianity and Islam. And again, I think that principal idea of discomfort crops up again, of these are hard conversations to have, but I think we have to have them because people will always gravitate towards a simplest explanation of, no, it's only a true practice within this tradition if you commit to these ideals and these principles. And I think there's more room within the church, within the temple, within the Sangha, for us to invite more people in, with more recognition that maybe we can broaden the limits of what we want, while still recognizing that maybe some element of ethics and worldviews has to be part of the conversation. But maybe if we broaden our tent and make it a little bit bigger, we can have a more meaningful dialogue.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. So out of respect for your time and the time of our listeners or viewers, can I ask one last question?
Sure.
What's next for the center, and what's next for your personal projects and contemplative studies? What bridges are you building?
Look, so for the center, one of the things that we're trying to really understand and think about is how do we think about encouraging people to engage in practice in a way that is authentic, but also in a way that recognizes the reality of what they may encounter. So I think part of what we're trying to have conversations about, particularly in Australia, but also we're starting to have these globally, is how do we decide what a good teacher looks like? How do we ensure that communities are available and accessible? And how do we sort of protect people within those communities? I think one of the things where, particularly organized religion has fallen down, and we're starting to see some reform, is that people in positions of power have unfortunately sort of taken advantage of that. And I think that's a risk and a temptation in anyone who ends up in a position of power or authority, is that it's always very simple and easy to do the human thing and let that power corrupt you. So I think a personal kind of endeavor of my own, but also something that we've been thinking about a lot in the center, is how do we safeguard against that? How do we make it more about the communities of practice and less about individuals, which is to say, in particular, leaders? I think the more we can buffer traditions against gurus, and the more we can think about communities kind of supporting each other and maybe trying to flatten the hierarchy, as it will, trying to make people more accountable to one another, I think the more people may be able to benefit from these practices, trust that they're getting something that is of value. But I think that's a long undertaking, I should say. And I think, it's one that it's going to require a lot of conversations with a lot of stakeholders. But I think it's a conversation in particular where we're looking at this from the perspective of, say, healthcare provision. Is there a role for meditation or meditative practices in the mental health crisis, in the loneliness epidemic? I think it is. I think there is a role, and I think part of that has a lot to do with the fact that I don't think it's just mental health or loneliness. I think what we're facing is much more of an existential crisis, which is to say that many of us are suffering from a lack of purpose and meaning. Now, I think, of course, there are many people who are also suffering from mental illness and really need help and support. But I think there are a lot of people who don't necessarily need to see a psychologist or therapist, and they're going to these individuals asking for existential help or support. And as someone who's trained in that area, I will say I'm not necessarily the best person to guide them on that path. I think we have many people in many traditions who are trained for exactly that, but we need to figure out, how do we encourage the public to know that these people are there, and how do we help those providers to be part of that conversation? So it's a tricky path to navigate, but that's really where my heart is at the moment.
Thank you, Nicholas. Nicholas, if people want to learn more about your work, how can they do so?
I'm easily findable, accessible online. The Contemplative Studies Center, you can just type Contemplative Studies Center, University of Melbourne, and UniMel on Google, and it'll pop up. But also very happy to get in touch. I don't hide my contact information, so I'm very happy for people to email me or reach out to me via other means.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for your time, for being with us here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.